Joining us now to talk about Iran is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Mimi. Thanks for having me.
I'd just like to let our audience know that we have having a bit of a problem with our phone lines, but we do have an alternate system that has our backup system is up and ready. And I wanted to share those phone lines with you so that you have them. It's Republicans are going to be calling us on 202-737-0002. Democrats will call on 202-737-0001. And independents, it's 202-628-0205. So please be aware of those numbers. Just for now, that's our backup system. Behnam, I wanted to ask you about obviously what's going on in the Middle East. There's a lot of tensions right now. Get us back up to speed about how we got to this point and what's happening right now.
Sure, where depends on how you want to start. Sometimes the state of play can be based on the past 45 years, but the current cycle of escalation comes amid larger Iran-Israel tensions since October 7th. As you know, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been fighting something of a shadow war or a proxy war against the Jewish state in various forms. But really, since October 7th, that war has moved from the shadows and into the kind of kinetic and conventional battle space, such that today it wouldn't be a stretch to say Israel is fighting a multi-front war, probably a 4, 5, 6, or even, depending on how you count the West Bank, 7-front conflict that does involve shooting or stabbing or killing, backed ultimately by a patron, that is the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Israelis, it's assumed to be the Israelis anyways, reported to be them, were recently accused of killing Ismail Haniyeh, the political chief of Hamas. That's one of the Palestinian terror groups that the Islamic Republic supports. That was the architect behind the October 7th terrorist attack. And they killed him while he was in Tehran about a week and a half ago, while he was there for the swearing in of Iran's new president, the 9th president of the Islamic Republic, Masoud Pezeshkian. There were conflicting reports about how this person was killed, by the way.
That's what I was going to ask you about. How were they able to do it?
This really gets to the heart of the matter because a lot of the mainstream Western reporting, New York Times, Axios, what have you, are talking about a planted bomb that was put into the safe house, the place where Ismail Haniyeh was staying in Tehran, where he was guarded by the regime's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then at some point between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. after the inauguration ceremony, that bomb was remotely detonated. Now, if that story is true, it would be a gross embarrassment for the security services of the Islamic Republic to have not properly secured the facility, to have one of the heads of this constellation of terror and proxy groups that the regime calls the Acts of Resistance assassinated by an adversarial foreign intelligence service on their own soil. And it reminds us all of a larger trend line of these foreign intelligence service assassinations of at least 6 nuclear scientists, 3 missile engineers, and that history of sabotage and cyber attacks against the regime's nuclear program. That's what's being reported. The regime is trying to cover up or push back, say, no, it was a projectile fired from outside the building that was very targeted and had about a 7-kilogram warhead and just happened to hit the room that Ismail Haniyeh was in.
And but what difference does that make as to how it was done? Like, is this really just a big embarrassment for Tehran that Israel was able to do this?
It would be a grotesque embarrassment if the Axios and New York Times story ended up being true, which I think that is, when you look at the trend line, in all likelihood, what happened. And that's precisely why the regime is trying to push back and say, no, this wasn't planted in. This was some rogue element firing it from outside. And you had a current minister of intelligence say that this was a move done by the Israeli Mossad, green-lighted by the U.S., and that kind of dual blaming has been cascading across not just the Friday prayer lectern last week in Iran, but across tons of newspapers. And really the word of the week in Iran is bloodlust, because they're seeking to avenge the killing of Ismail Haniyeh and to kind of atone for this sense of embarrassment.
So tell us what Iranian capabilities look like at this point, and what a retaliation against Israel, what kind of form that could take.
So despite this regime having a constellation of terror and proxy forces, that have gone after Israeli and Jewish assets on at least 3 different continents over the past 4+ decades. Since April 13 or April 14, and that's when the regime fired a historic and first time ever direct military attack from its own territory against Israel, involving medium-range ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones. These are not signaling weapons. These are weapons of war. They're designed to kill. I think they wanted to be seen as responding at that time on April 13, April 14, due to the Israelis going after what the regime alleged was a consulate, but what turned out to be just a building in downtown Damascus that was housing several members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so the regime, you could say, lost its fear of this kind of overt and direct military conflict. And that's why now, every time there's another boom and bust cycle of tensions between Iran and Israel, there's the chance that a Cold War could go hot or a shadow war could come out to the public. And the regime is very likely now to be employing some combination of, again, land attack cruise missiles, suicide drones, and medium-range ballistic missiles to strike Israel. But when you're looking at the Persian reporting now, they're also talking about multi-directional proxy fire. Rather than just have the regime fire everything at once from Iranian territory against Israel, what's being talked about is a 360-degree attack vector to have Israel potentially attack from the north and the south and the east and the west at the same time.
And how worried is the Iranian regime about escalation? Are they still, I mean, this happened in April of last year where they launched a bunch of attacks, but most of them didn't hit. Has that calculus changed now?
Well, I think if you look at the April 13, April 14 operation as purely through military terms, the fact that when you look at ballistic missiles, for example, half of them failed even before they got to the boost phase, that would be a major red flag. But politically, I think the Islamic Republic won that escalatory round with the Israelis. And that's because the patron or the partner of the Israelis, the United States of America, rushed in to get the Israelis to, quote, according to the Biden administration, take the win, to not be seen as overtly responding and essentially not be able to claim the Israeli military response against the regime, which was exceptionally targeted and exceptionally limited. And because of that, Tehran really does feel like it won that round. And rather than give it pause or give it caution, I think it is actually going to push the regime to be a bit more emboldened. And in particular, when you layer on things that are going in Washington right now that really the whole world is seeing, which is kind of the change between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, all these questions about U.S. staying power in the region, all these questions about multiple other geographic commitments for U.S. forces, be they in Asia or for Europe, the regime may hope to kind of achieve a death by 1,000 cuts against us and kind of divide the Americans and the Israelis. And that also may help explain, by the way, why the uptick in rocket attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria has been happening as we speak.
And we will start to take your calls shortly. I'll remind you that we have a backup system set up right now with new phone lines, and that is Republicans 202-737-0002, Democrats on 202-737-0001, and Independents 202-628-0205. Behnam Ben Taleblu, I want to ask you about Iran's economy and how they're doing right now, and how long can they sustain the support of all these proxies that they've got?
Well, it depends. The Iranian economy certainly is not doing well, but relatively it's improved over the past few years, even though there are issues like inflation in the economy. There's significant devaluation of the rial, the Iranian currency, on the official exchange rate market every time there's a crisis relative to the U.S. dollar. And the reason for that kind of artificial sense of economic emboldenment, despite the poor macroeconomic indicators, is that the regime has been able to sell a heck of a lot more oil over the past 2.5, 3 years under the more permissive environment of the Biden administration, where international and particularly U.S. oil sanctions are not being enforced. The vast majority of Iran's oil and even petrochemicals do go to East Asia, do go to America's great power competitor, that's the People's Republic of China. So in my view, it's a moral and a political and a strategic failure for the U.S. to not be actively enforcing these sanctions. But nonetheless, that's where we are, and that's why you keep getting these record highs. While legally sanctions are in effect, politically and practically they may not be, and they're not imposing that transaction cost on a U.S. adversary, which allows the regime to generate just enough revenue not to improve the livelihood of Iranians at home who have continuously been protesting. And in fact, every time there is a national security crisis, they take a sharply different view than the regime. They take a sharply different view on October 7th. They took a sharply different view after the accidental helicopter crash of Iran's former President Raisi. And they have a sharply different view of Ismail Haniyeh. Because since 2009, Iranians have been chanting in the streets, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran. So the population understands that whenever the regime is put to the choice, the regime will always choose guns over butter. And that's why even under economic duress or poor economic conditions, this regime continues continues to funnel its limited resources and limited revenues to developing its missile program, drone program, nuclear program, and to keep its proxies afloat.
All right, let's talk to callers, and we'll start with Tom in Pennsylvania, Democrat. Good morning, Tom.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Thanks for having me on. If there was white people doing this kind of stuff instead of Muslims, it would be ended yesterday. Okay. The reason we are allowing this is because a certain group of people are allowed to be racist in this country, but other people can't. So my suggestion is for the Americans to get tough with Iran, and they could end this in a weekend, because Iran are a bunch of cowards, just like Democrats are cowards, and they could go over there and they could wipe out their centrifuges and they could take out their oil fields, and that would be the end of Iran. Because Iran is a coward.
Well, let's get a response. Behnam Ben Taleblu, what do you think of that?
Well, I think if the caller is talking about a potential U.S. military option against the Islamic Republic, as Americans continue to have very public debates over how to handle this, is this a problem we have to manage, or is this a problem we have to solve? Do we have to kick the can down the road, or are we supposed to get rid of the can altogether? As we have these very public debates, the Iranians are listening and watching and adjusting their program accordingly. And the more Americans have kind of removed the military option, even rhetorically or politically, from the docket, not something that they need to do, but something they need to be able to credibly threaten, you could see actually the more advanced the Iranian nuclear program is becoming. And right now, again, with that change up of the Democratic ticket and a potential period of transition and turbulence, even in our democracy, I am quite worried about the period between now and the election, and the period between the election and January 20, no matter who comes in, because that could be an opportunity for the regime to go ahead because they believe the military option would be significantly devalued.
So, Behnam, I mean, just to be clear, are you recommending then that the rhetoric on the American side be mention the military option as a possibility? What are you saying exactly would be the best approach?
It's certainly, the regime has to believe that the military option has to be credible. And when you look at the region, I think in one of our earlier questions, we talked about Iraq at the tail end. After the U.S. responded to the loss of 3 American service persons at the hands of pro-Iran militias that targeted a U.S. base in Jordan via a drone, killing those 3 service persons back in late January, the U.S. responded in a big way. It was a big credit to the Biden administration. They responded against multiple targets, safe houses, and even militia leaders in Iraq and Syria. And they essentially bought about 20-plus weeks of deterrence. And when you zoom out, the response ratio between U.S. and these pro-Iran militias in the region since October 7 to present is about 172 times they have struck us, and about 11 times we have responded militarily against them. And the regime may be calculating, if we are too afraid to even kinetically respond against some of these targets in Syria or Iraq, then we may not entertain politically and militarily that which we've been saying, which is for 4 different U.S. administrations, perhaps 5, depending on how you count Bill Clinton. But Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have all said Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And so in the minds of the regime, if you're not going to use the military option against an easier target, then certainly you may not use it against a harder target. And no matter what presidents may say, that actual military tool would be devalued in the eyes of the adversary. And particularly when you add on that the regime now has these missiles and drones that maybe 10, 15 years ago they didn't have before, it becomes emboldened. And that's why the ability to credibly signal the will to use it, not to actually have to use it, is really, for lack of a better word, the art of the deal here.
All right, and Richard is in Delaware on the line for Democrats. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I'd like to know how we get out of this mess, how we finally solve this in a way that peace resumes in the Middle East, and the vocabulary that I hear the guests using is boom and bust cycles, and response ratios, and all of that sort of thing. I just wonder. I know your organization is there for the defense of democracies, and that's great. But how do you wind up seeing that we can reach an end point where nobody's shooting anybody?
All right, go ahead, Behnam Ben Taleblu.
Listen, it's a question close to the head and close to the heart, because everybody does want peace, everybody does want stability. It just depends at what cost and under whose authority and under whose control. The Islamic Republic, if you look at the messaging and the narratives coming out of that anti-American, that authoritarian, that Islamist regime, they'll frame their regional quest for stability and peace and transparency, but it contrasts very sharply with the efforts on the ground, with that which they're trying to do. And again, when you go back all the way to the beginning of our segment, when we talk about this being a multi-front war that the regime has been able to orchestrate since October 7 against the Israelis and kind of get away scot-free for it, until this regime has to pay a significant enough price. And I would go one step further. So long as the Islamic Republic continues to be able to be in existence, to carry out its ideology through the prism of the national security of that country, we're going to be going through, unfortunately, those boom and bust cycles. Someone like me, a Iranian American, would say that you have to have a complementary element of soulcraft to your statecraft. You have to have maximum support for the Iranian people who have been protesting against this regime, and it's one of the few kind of islands of pro-Americanism in that region, despite the very anti-American government. And you need to have maximum pressure against the regime, that the tough economic sanctions, the enforcement over time, the credible military threat, as a complementary tool. And if you don't marry those two tools, unfortunately, we're going to run the clock on those boom and bust cycles of conflict.
And next up is Mark in Oklahoma, Independent Line. Good morning.
Hey, Mimi. Good to talk to you. It's always good to have intercourse with you. We've talked like 3 or 4 times now. You're looking beautiful as ever. Thanks for taking my call. Hey, Mr. Behnam, you seem like a very intelligent guy to me. You seem like you know the game. But what's really interesting, the energy that you portray to society is like a chess game. King against king, pawns get sacrificed. If we want to stop this game of nonsense, if you've ever played chess, Behnam, I don't know if it's tail blue or not, but let's tell the real story. Let's tell it blue. And if a king gets on a king, it's a stalemate. There is no checkmate. So to stop this nonsense of putting young people sacrificing for the king and let these kings go at it, if they really want to have a fight, let them have a fight. If a common Joe gets killed in Iran, nothing happens. But if a hierarchy official gets killed in Iran, now we're going to throw this game into war. Why does that happen, sir?
It's a good point, Mark. And Behnam, I do want to ask you about how important was Ismail Haniyeh to Iran? And was it just a point of, he was just some Hamas leader that got assassinated in Iran, and it's embarrassing? Or was he actually important to their strategic goals?
So let me just start with one analogy based on what the caller said, and we can back into the importance of Ismail Haniyeh. And that's actually a very good question, because the Islamic Republic almost lost Hamas, and we'll get back to that in 1 second. But the caller mentioned the game of chess. I would like to put forward a slightly different tabletop game, which is backgammon. The whole game of backgammon is a strategic retreat, but the number of paces that you can make is entirely based on luck, the roll of the dice. So strategy, like you're talking about in chess, matters a lot, but context matters and what you can do with what you have. Sometimes you can have a great skill, but if you keep rolling a bad hand, if the situation keeps changes, all the facts are the same, but like a kaleidoscope, it keeps moving based on context, then it's going to be really hard for you to bring your skill to bear. And sometimes when folks often refer to all of these crises in the Middle East as a game of chess, I like to push back because sometimes we don't control every single exogenous event. And that's why it reminds me of a game of backgammon rather than a game of chess. And I'm saying that as someone who prefers backgammon over chess. But Mimi, to your question about Haniyeh, the Islamic Republic, when it interjected itself into the Palestinian issue, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, with them trying to get into the Madrid conference and not being able to, it invested heavily into Palestinian rejectionist groups to be able to be a spoiler to peace. And it was in the precursor to that time that Palestinian Islamic Jihad was inspired to be created by the Islamic Republic, and that Hamas was slowly able to be co-opted as a threat to the peace process by the Islamic Republic. And over time, political, material, financial support to these groups escalated significantly. But when you fast forward to the Arab Spring, and if you remember, Hamas's headquarters used to be in Syria, Iran and Hamas almost had a falling out because Iran was sacrificing everything to keep the Assad regime in power in Syria. And Hamas actually had moved at that time from Damascus to Doha, and they tried to align themselves with elements of the Arab Street, particularly the Islamist elements of the Arab Street that were trying to push back against the Assad regime. But Ismail Haniyeh was someone who could save that relationship, who helped Tehran bridge those troubled waters, and really was able, starting in 2017, to get the regime to double down, to continue to give its financial, military, and economic support to this Palestinian terror group. So Ismail Haniyeh occupies a very special place in the history and the relationship between the patron and the proxy, between the Islamic Republic of Iran and another one of these tentacles of the axis of resistance. So when you take this personal story that Haniyeh was having, when you take this trajectory, this multi-decade history between Iran and Hamas, and then you layer that on top of the embarrassing way for the regime in which he was killed on their own territory, it gets us exactly to that situation that we spoke about today, which is why the regime continues to talk about bloodlust, why the regime, despite having meetings with the Saudis, with the Russians now, and even with the Jordanians, still appears intent on flexing its military muscles. That's how deep this cut for them.
This is not necessarily related to Iran, but you might have heard the New York Times is reporting Taylor Swift's Vienna concerts are canceled after terror plot arrests. And also Zelda in Delaware sent us a text about that. Those are terrorist threats connected to the Islamic State. She says, can you comment on that? And do you think this is because U.S. involvement overseas? What do you think of that, Behnam?
No, I think the Islamic State, many of these terror groups that are transnational, the Islamic State, a little bit different from the Islamic Republic, even though they're kind of pushing for the same end state, is drastically trying to recruit through, again, its desire for lone wolf radicalization, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, but also in Europe. And I think right now is trying to go for another mass casualty terrorist attack. I don't believe that to be driven by the U.S. force presence in the region, which with the small exception right now of another potential Iran-Israel shooting war, has been getting smaller, not bigger. I think this is the effect of us not really having a strategic way to manage this terrorism threat and a real way to push back on this terrorism threat and allow the blowback that people believe would be coming post the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan now is manifesting itself in these transnational terrorist threats.
All right, Ed is up next in Georgia on the Independent line. Ed?
Yeah, thank you there, mister, for being on C-SPAN, and we love it that when there's a guest on that can share some information that we really need to hear. What's a bummer, though, is we have to hear every caller say good morning back to Mimi, and then we have to hear that clown talk about how pretty Mimi looks today. Mimi, would you ask people to go ahead, please, instead of saying good morning to you?
All right, Ed, stop saying good morning and go ahead.
That's what I had to say. I want to hear the next caller get you to tell us how you're doing today.
You called in to say stop saying hello and good morning?
Yeah, really. Get somebody else to say good morning back to you and then ask you how you're doing, Clyde.
All right. Lewis in Alabama, Democrat, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Go ahead, Lewis.
Yes, I called in several months ago and I pretty much said what a gentleman said a little while ago. We've got to be up top with Iran. We can't piecemeal this thing through. We've got to be, up front instantly. What we could do is load up 6 B-1 bombers, 2 with blockbusters, and 2 and 4 with incinerator bombs. We take out Iran's oil fields. The CIA, you can bet, knows where they are building the bomb on the ground. We have some blockbuster 2,000-pound bombs that could cave it in.
So Behnam Ben Taleblu, what would happen if that were the case, as the caller outlined?
Well, there's, as the caller was mentioning, he said the agency knew where exactly some of this stuff was happening. I want to draw the viewers and listeners to a story, actually, from Axios in June and July of this year, which didn't get much press. Senator Lindsey Graham now is foot-stomping something very similar to it, which is reporting from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, changed language slightly, but it matters a lot, about their confidence in the threat assessment about Iran's pursuit of a potential threshold capability and the impact of a lot of Iran's nuclear advances. And the Axios story from earlier this summer was essentially saying that there was computer modeling going on in Iran. We don't know exactly computer modeling of what element, but the story was believing, or leading one to believe, that this was happening in the direction of weaponization, and also metallurgy, a critical skill, particularly for warhead miniaturization, and to create those fears. And when you go back into 2021, you realize this regime actually had been producing uranium metal, particularly at the highly enriched uranium level, the 20% level, which could be, God forbid, one day a stand-in for weapons grade level, which is 90%. So the aggregate effect is that our lack of a policy on Iran has allowed the regime to very incrementally master a whole series of technologies that, per what the caller was saying, I fear that whether it's the intelligence community or the International Atomic Energy Agency or U.S. policymakers or academics or think tankers, they may not have access to the same picture at once and may miss the aggregate effect of all of these things. And given that our debates about how to solve versus how to manage the Iran issue are so partisan and immediately lead to, recommendations of all-out war, recommendations of really all-out appeasement, the Islamic Republic has been able to kind of take advantage of this entire political dichotomy. So, one thing that the caller was talking about was this kind of sense of perfect intelligence. What I see looking at the Iran debate is a very imperfect, fragmented debate where we can't even agree, unfortunately, on the facts, let alone about what to do with those facts.
Alan is in Hawaii on the line for Independence. Hi, Alan.
Hello. Good to speak to you. Ben, I called you. I think I got to speak to you briefly a few months ago in May when there was the death of the Iranian president. I have a few items. I'm going to try to get them if you'll let me. First item, maybe you can bring it up if you have time, and if you're familiar, is Michael Duran's concept of what he calls the realignment. And I'll move on because I would love to have Michael Duran talk about that too. I was also going to bring up the bunker buster concept that Israel may need to be fabricating their own bunker busters if the U.S. continues under, unfortunately, a Harris administration in a full-out arms embargo. And this is a big problem. David Albright recently brought up information about new information from public sources about their hardened underground facilities. My other question is about the Iranian assassination effort. The handler was arrested on July 12th. I was curious if you knew anything about that. And of course,
could you repeat that last part? Who was arrested?
Well, I guess on July 12th, there was a man arrested by the FBI who supposedly was Pakistani. And
the recent story where the regime allegedly paid him $5,000. He has family in Iran, but he's supposed to kill a U.S. official, right?
Exactly. And I mean, the big thing is, my question it was to you last time was Robert Malley, and I know you didn't know that much about it, and we probably won't know for a long time. But if you could tie these items together, that would be great, and I'll let you proceed.
Sure. Let me just try to run through as much as I can there quickly and tie them together, even though I do think they kind of fall into different buckets. One is the last one you mentioned, which is a non-Iranian and a non-proxy, if you will, of the Islamic Republic, a Pakistani individual. The AP reported a story about 2 days ago based on the DOJ indictment of a Pakistani individual with family in Iran who allegedly the regime paid to allegedly go after a U.S. person or actually a U.S. official in an assassination attempt. Fortunately, that person was unsuccessful. But this points to a much larger problem. And even though there was the indictment issued and thankfully no U.S. person or U.S. official killed or no U.S. official assassinated, it gets to a larger picture, which is that for the past 10, 15 years now, the regime, particularly in North America, particularly in the United States of America, has been moving from lone wolf radicalization to proxy to transnational criminal syndicates. And what may appear to us as a whole series of sloppy moves to find take what they can and throw it at the wall and see what sticks. Ultimately, this is the regime poking and prodding and looking for a soft underbelly. If you remember back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, the Quds Force tried to work with a Mexican drug cartel to kill the Saudi ambassador. That was thwarted. If you look at attempts to kill or capture Iranian dissidents, defectors, or members of the diaspora, some of whom are even U.S. citizens now, these involved everything from kidnapping plots to take them to Venezuela, to working with European mafias, to working with Canadian biker gangs. And then, when you most recently add on this story of the Pakistani individual, this is how the Islamic Republic is trying to mask its hand today. And it's not just about proxy forces, it's about the regime's ability to tap into criminal networks in country or transnational criminal syndicates to hide its hand and also achieve some of the goals that it wants against the adversary. So even though some may say, don't worry, Behnam, this was sloppy tradecraft, the U.S. was able to thwart it or stop it, my pushback to that is, no, this shows a high degree of intentionality, and they're going to keep trying until they get something that lands, which means we have to be super vigilant and have an actual policy towards not just thwarting this, but stopping this and make sure they pay a price for it. So that's the transnational element. If we go back up one to the bunker buster bomb comment, sure, I think Israel does need those bombs to be able to credibly threaten that they do solo have a military threat against some of those more deeply buried nuclear facilities. The GBU-57 is something that the U.S. has. I think that can go 60 meters. The report you mentioned by David Albright talking about the new facility that is being tunneled way deep, not under Fordo, which is near the holy city of Qom, but near the Natanz enrichment site. That is called Kuhe Kolang, and the Iranians are saying that that may be a future enrichment facility, but a future centrifuge construction facility, but we fear that may be a future enrichment facility. And given that's 100 meters rather than 60 meters below the surface of the Earth, that would make even some of the bombs that we have present not probably the easiest target, but a really tough target to be able to hit. So it's not just about the Israelis being able to develop a capability on their own. It is actually about what credible threat can we have as well. And if the Israelis were looking for things to put on their shopping list, something that would go above, in my view, some of those bunker buster bombs would be the KC-46 aerial refueler, to be able to signal that they have an option to, have sorties over time against the Islamic Republic. So that is that. And then to the final question, I think you mentioned a thesis by Mike Durant about a decade ago in Washington about a realignment. I don't think everybody in the Obama administration believed that thesis, where basically the U.S. had to realign with the other side of the Persian Gulf, with Iran, and was more willing to be skeptical of some of the traditional U.S. partners in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, what have you. But I do think that the Obama administration was very successful in making the case to pivot away from the region altogether, and that rather than solve the crises in the region, and rather than stand with our partners in the region, what we had to do is get them to come together so that we can manage the crisis such that ultimately the U.S. could push away. And I think right now we're seeing not the dividends of that policy, but we're seeing the costs of that policy, because it's been about a little bit less than a decade since that policy has been at the helm and been implemented, and the region is much less safe, not much more safe. And our allies are having to hedge towards their adversaries because of a lot of the political costs and the shocks that were introduced to them from that alleged realignment.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.